The restaurant smelled faintly of roasted garlic and polished oak. The kind of smell that makes you think, for a moment, that everything in the world is orderly and perfect. I sat across from her, my fiancée, in the low light. The kind that turns every corner into a shadow and every shadow into a secret. She had that soft smile that once made my chest tighten in the best way. The one that had made me fall in love with her over and over again. But tonight, there was a tremor beneath it. A subtle hesitation I couldn't immediately name. We had ordered our usual table for two, our favorite corner spot by the window, and I had been looking forward to this dinner for weeks. It wasn't just any dinner, it was the night I had intended to surprise her with a little gesture, something symbolic of the life we had promised each other. But as she spoke, every plan I had carefully tucked away in my mind unraveled in a single sentence. I think we should take a break from our wedding plans. I need to figure out who I really am. The words landed softly, almost politely, but they struck me like a bell in the quiet room. I froze for a second, the fork in my hand hovering awkwardly over my plate. My mind raced to process them, a flood of reactions competing for attention, confusion, disbelief, hurt, and a surprising, almost cruel sense of relief. Perfect timing, I thought, though I barely understood why my own mind chose that particular reaction. I studied her face, tracing the lines that I knew so well. Lines that had once been etched with laughter and late-night confessions, now subtly marked by doubt. The way she avoided my eyes, the slight tremble in her fingers as she rested them on the table, was all too real. Her voice had that hesitant quiver, not fully confident in the words it carried, and yet the words themselves. They weren't an accusation, they weren't a blame. They were simply her truth, spilling out in the most honest way she could manage. I set my fork down deliberately, letting a silence stretch between us. I could feel the tension in the room like an invisible weight pressing down on the table, twisting the familiar warmth into something sharp and uncertain. Around us, other diners chatted and laughed, oblivious to the private storm unfolding just a few feet away. The low hum of the restaurant seemed to accentuate her voice, making it sharper, more intimate, and painfully real. I don't know if I'm ready to make that kind of lifelong commitment right now, she continued, her gaze finally lifting to meet mine for a fleeting second. I love you, but I think I need some time to understand myself first. I nodded slowly, my smile careful, measured, almost as if I were performing a role rather than reacting naturally. Perfect timing, I reminded myself again, though the phrase felt increasingly hollow as her eyes searched mine for reassurance I wasn't sure I could give. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here we were, a couple who had planned, dreamed, and imagined our future together for years, suddenly confronted with a pause neither of us had anticipated. The narrative of our life so neatly plotted in my mind was now uncertain, a story rewritten in real time. She reached for her glass of wine, twirling it absent-mindedly. I watched the liquid catch the dim light, the way it swirled and shimmered, a miniature storm in a crystal globe. And I realized, maybe this was her way of asking me to see her differently, to understand that love isn't always about certainty, about forward motion. Sometimes it's about stillness, about pause, about giving each other room to breathe and grow. I don't want to hurt you, she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the soft background music. I need to find out who I am before we take that step. Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity, and I felt a complex wave of emotions, frustration, fear, and a strange, liberating clarity. Perfect timing, I whispered silently, realizing that maybe this interruption was exactly what we both needed. The timing wasn't perfect in the world's sense, but in the sense of truth, of exposure, it was impeccable. I reached across the table, placing my hand lightly over hers. The touch was gentle, not possessive, just grounding. I understand, I said quietly, letting the words settle like a soft blanket over the tension. If this is what you need, I can wait, and I want you to take all the time you need. Her eyes widened, a flicker of relief crossing her face, and she nodded slowly. There was no dramatic embrace, no sweeping declaration. Just two people sitting across from each other, facing a truth that had been quietly looming, finally admitted aloud. We spent the rest of the dinner talking in fragments. Not about weddings or futures, but about ourselves. about dreams deferred and fears acknowledged, about what it meant to love someone not just for the image of them we wanted, but for the reality, the messy, uncertain reality. I found myself sharing thoughts I hadn't voiced even to myself, reflections on who I was, what I needed, and how love, perhaps, was not about certainty at all, but about patience, about holding space for one another even when the story seems paused. The waiter brought dessert, a shared chocolate tart, and I watched as she smiled genuinely for the first time that evening. There was no false cheer, no attempt to smooth over the cracks, just a quiet, honest smile that said more than words ever could. In that moment, I understood that this pause wasn't an ending. It wasn't a rejection. It was a deeper engagement with the truth, with ourselves, with each other. When the bill came, I paid it without a word, letting the small act be a gesture of calm, of normalcy amidst the emotional turbulence. We left the restaurant side by side, walking in silence for a few blocks, the night air cool and clear around us. The city hummed quietly, indifferent to our private revelations, and yet somehow, that indifference was comforting. Life continued, the world continued, and in its continuity, there was room for us to pause without fear. By the time we reached her apartment, the silence had transformed. It was no longer heavy or oppressive. It was contemplative, reflective. We hugged briefly, a touch of reassurance and mutual respect, and parted with the understanding that this chapter, though uncertain, was not a failure. It was a space for honesty, for growth, for recalibration, and as I walked home alone, I felt a curious mixture of melancholy and hope. Perfect timing, I thought one last time, smiling to myself. Not because life had aligned neatly with my plans, but because truths, sometimes sharp, sometimes unsettling, had revealed itself in exactly the right moment. The days after that dinner were strange, suspended in a kind of liminal space where everything felt both familiar and foreign. I went through the motions of my routine work, errands, quiet evenings at home, but beneath each act, there was an undercurrent of thought, a constant return to that night, to her words, to the pause we had agreed upon. At first, I tried to distract myself. I filled my calendar with meetings, calls, and late-night writing sessions. Anything to keep my mind from circling too relentlessly around her absence and the uncertainty of our love. Yet, no matter how I tried, the questions always crept back. What did it mean to figure out who you really are in the middle of a committed relationship? Could love survive a deliberate pause, a conscious stepping back, without breaking under the weight of doubt and distance? I realized that I had never fully asked myself these questions, had never paused to consider what love demanded beyond the surface of desire, intimacy, and shared dreams. I began to remember moments from our past, fragments I had buried in the comfortable haze of nostalgia. The first time we met, in a crowded bookstore. She had been arguing passionately about a novel I barely understood, yet her conviction had drawn me in. That spark, that immediate connection, had evolved into months of laughter, late-night conversations, and the kind of easy companionship that feels both rare and fragile. I thought of our first trip together, the way we got lost in a small coastal town, finding joy in misdirection, the way she had held my hand through moments of uncertainty. And yet, amid all those memories, I also remembered the moments of tension we had never fully resolved. Miscommunications, fleeting jealousies, small betrayals of expectation, compromises silently resented. These reflections weren't about blame. They were about understanding, about seeing our love as it truly was, not just as I had imagined it. I realized that our connection had always been vibrant, yes, but also imperfect. And perhaps it was precisely this imperfection that required us to pause now, to breathe, to examine who we were as individuals before we could fully embrace the shared path of a lifetime. I started journaling late at night, pouring my thoughts onto paper in a way I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I wrote about the dinner, her words, the silence between us, and the strange peace I had felt despite the initial shock. I wrote about my fear of losing her, fear of stagnation, fear of confronting truths about myself I had long ignored. And I wrote about hope, the hope that love, if nurtured with honesty and patience, could adapt, evolve, and emerge stronger from the uncertainty. Through these reflections, I began to see a pattern. A kind of inner architecture of our relationship that had been invisible to me in the everyday rush. Our love wasn't a smooth, predictable path. It was a series of adjustments, compromises, revelations, and It required courage, not only to embrace each other's strengths, but also to confront vulnerabilities, insecurities, and the silent doubts that often go unspoken. And perhaps, I realized, this was the ultimate test not of whether we were right for each other, but of whether we were willing to grow together while respecting the growth of the self. I found myself revisiting old letters she had written me, small notes and emails I had tucked away in a drawer. Reading them now, with the fresh lens of her pause, they resonated differently. There were hints of longing and questioning, of dreams not fully articulated, of a desire for self-understanding that had been buried beneath our shared plans. I began to understand that her request wasn't a withdrawal of love, but a plea for authenticity, a desire to step fully into herself so that she could step fully into our union, later if the timing and the truth aligned as the days turned into weeks. I allowed myself to explore my own sense of identity and desire, something I had often subordinated to the relationship. I revisited old hobbies, long-forgotten passions, and even friends I had neglected in the daily routine of planning a shared future. These excursions weren't distractions. They were excavations, uncovering parts of myself I had overlooked. I realized that to love her fully, I needed to understand myself fully, too, to confront not only the parts I cherished, but also the insecurities and fears I had long avoided. One quiet evening, I found myself at a small park near my apartment, sitting on a bench under a tree whose leaves had begun to turn golden. The wind carried the scent of fall, crisp and clear, and I let the world settle around me. I imagined her there, walking beside me, sharing a silence that was not uncomfortable but reflective. In that imagined presence, I felt a connection stronger than before, rooted not in the certainty of plans, but in the awareness of each other's truths. I also began to recognize how much I had idealized the notion of love as seamless and uninterrupted. True love, I realized, is messy. It involves pauses, doubts, growth, and sometimes separation, not as an end, but as a means of refining the bond, making it more resilient and authentic. My heart, once impatient and anxious for the future we had mapped out, now found a rhythm in the waiting, in the contemplation, in the embrace of uncertainty as a necessary companion of intimacy. During this period of reflection, I occasionally heard from her, brief messages, small notes, a text here or there. Each one was careful, thoughtful, revealing not distance but attention, a thread connecting us even as we explored our individual paths. The communications were not frequent, but they were deliberate, an acknowledgement that even in the pause, our bond persisted. And so, I learned patience, not the kind born of resignation, but the kind born of understanding and trust. Patience to allow her to explore herself, patience to explore myself, patience to let our love breathe and expand in ways that didn't rely on rigid timelines or expectations. I came to see that the depth of love is often measured not by uninterrupted togetherness, but by the willingness to hold space for one another's growth, even when that growth temporarily diverges from the shared path. Through these weeks, my perspective on our relationship transformed. I no longer feared the pause. I embraced it as a crucible, a test of our commitment and our capacity for empathy, reflection, and adaptation. And in embracing it, I discovered a new strength within myself, calm confidence that our love could endure, evolve, and deepen, not despite uncertainty, but because of it. The inner journey was not easy. Some nights were restless, filled with doubts and imagined endings. Yet each morning brought clarity, a renewed sense of purpose, and a subtle, persistent hope. I realized that the pause she had requested was not a break in the narrative of our love, but an essential interlude, a moment in which both of us could align our truths with our desires, and in doing so, prepare for a love that would be not only passionate but authentic, resilient, and enduring by the end of the second week. I felt a quiet transformation within myself. The anxiety and fear had softened into awareness and acceptance. I knew now that love is not a guarantee, not a preordained path, but a living, breathing entity that requires attention, honesty, and courage. And in this understanding, I found a deep, abiding hope that when we reunited fully, we would do so with clarity, with respect, and with a love that had been tested and tempered by time and reflection. The day she called me to meet was crisp, sunlight spilling across the city in warm, golden streaks. I arrived at the small cafe we had chosen, heart beating in a rhythm I hadn't felt in weeks, saying anxious, excited pulse that spoke of anticipation, fear, and hope all at once. She was already there, seated at our usual corner table, a book resting open before her, fingers tracing the lines of text almost absent-mindedly. When she looked up and saw me, her eyes held the same mixture of familiarity and curiosity that had drawn me to her in the first place. I walked toward her, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was a quiet understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that the space we had taken had changed us both. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but subtly, profoundly, in ways that only time and reflection can craft. I took my seat, and we exchanged a small tentative smile, the kind that holds a universe of unspoken words. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft, "about everything. About us, about myself, about what I want and need. And I realized that taking time was necessary, not to distance myself from you, but to understand how to be fully present in our love." Hearing this, I felt a swell of relief, tempered by the awareness that understanding and presence are not achieved in a moment, but through continuous effort and vulnerability. I nodded, allowing my emotions to settle, trusting the truth in her words. We spent hours talking that day, not about weddings or timelines, but about growth, fears, dreams, and the intricate layers of our individual selves. She spoke about the discoveries she had made, about passions she had rekindled, fears she had confronted, and aspirations she had clarified. And I shared my reflections, my realizations about patience, and the complexity of love that cannot exist without honesty and space. It became clear that the pause had done something essential. It had allowed us to see not only ourselves more clearly, but also the contours of our relationship. We recognized the patterns that had been unspoken, the assumptions we had silently carried, and the ways in which our love could either flourish or falter, depending on how we nurtured it. There was no dramatic epiphany, no sudden resolution. Instead, there was a quiet, deliberate understanding, a shared commitment to approach our love with renewed intention. As the weeks turned into months, we integrated these lessons into our daily lives. The pause had not ended. It had evolved into a rhythm, a pattern of mindful presence, attentive listening, and mutual support. We learned to celebrate small victories, to acknowledge struggles without judgment, and to maintain our individuality while cultivating our connection. In this way, the love that had been tested by uncertainty grew stronger, more resilient, and more deeply rooted in authenticity. One evening, as we walked hand in hand through a park lit by the soft glow of street lamps, she turned to me and smiled. "I'm ready," she said simply. Not ready in a hurried, anxious way, but ready in a grounded, whole sense. Ready to move forward, together. And in that moment, I understood fully what the pause had been for. It had been a crucible, a mirror, a gentle teacher guiding us toward a love that was not defined by timelines or expectations, but by the truth of who we were and what we were willing to nurture together. We did not rush into plans. We did not force perfection. Instead, we embraced the unfolding of our lives with patience, curiosity, and a deep appreciation for the journey itself. Every conversation, every shared moment, became richer, more intentional, because we had learned the value of presence, reflection, and honest communication. Our love, once tentative and untested, had been transformed by this experience. It was no longer the simple story of two people joining their lives. It was a layered, dynamic narrative of growth, trust, and commitment to authenticity. We had discovered that love is not a fixed endpoint, but a continuous journey, one that requires courage, patience, and the willingness to confront both uncertainty and vulnerability. In the quiet of a Sunday morning, sitting across from her at a small breakfast table, sipping coffee and sharing smiles, I realized that our story had been reshaped in the most profound way. The pause had not been a setback. It had been an awakening, and as I reached for her hand, feeling the warmth and certainty in our connection. I knew that we were ready not just for marriage, not just for shared plans, but for a love that had been tempered by reflection, strengthened by understanding, and illuminated by truth. That day, I finally allowed myself to fully embrace the notion that love is not about avoiding uncertainty, but about navigating it together with honesty, patience, and a commitment to seeing each other fully. And in that embrace, I found not only her, but also myself, and a shared future built not on assumption, but on conscious, deliberate, and enduring choice.